On the 24th of August 2001, Air Transat Flight 236 was out on the open ocean. That's when Captain Robert Pichet made a discovery that made his blood run cold. There was a leak under the right wing, and what seemed to be a glitch in the system just 13 minutes before was in fact a notification for all of their death sentences. First Officer Dirk de Jager called in the Mayday, and in the 10 minutes between the discovery and the call, both engines flamed out. The lights from front to end went dead, the control panel went dark, and the emergency oxygen mask dropped in front of the confused passengers and crew. They had no warning, no chance to prepare themselves for whatever it was that they were hurtling toward. A dead plane, with no engines, no fuel, and no hope of survival for the 306 people on board. Nearly 100 miles from the closest scrap of land, it glided, held up only by the laws of aerodynamics. For now. Because like a paper plane, it slowly began to float lower and lower, heading towards its inevitable doom at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. This is the story of Air Transat Flight 236. Like we always do, we need to look at the history of the Airbus A330-243 and the men in charge of flying her from Canada to Portugal. The Airbus was only 2 years old and equipped with twin-turbo Rolls-Royce engines. She'd never had any problems in the air before and shortly before that disastrous flight. Air Transat, the airline in Canada, gave 236 a maintenance check. There was a problem detected on the right-wing engine. The issue was never specified, but they felt it necessary to replace the engine entirely. They wanted her back in the air as fast as possible, so they decided against waiting for an identical engine. Instead, they borrowed an engine that was a different model, but similar enough to satisfy them while they waited for the new one to arrive. This isn't all that uncommon in aviation, but this engine, though similar, was not designed with tubing that was even close to the original. So the engineers MacGyvered a solution to force the tubing to fit. That would be the very tubes that transported the plane's fuel. Now, fuel isn't stored in a single tank. Each wing has a supply that feeds its own engine, and then there's another supply at the very tip of the tail. When the wing's fuel depletes, the back end resupplies them to keep the plane in perpetual balance, or else the center of gravity will shift, and the weight distribution would be off, and that would be a disastrous event in and of itself. Now, this fuel transfer from the back of the plane is relayed to the pilots, but it happens multiple times during a flight, so it can be easily overlooked if it's happening more often than usual. 236 did fine for her first 68 hours in the air after that rushed maintenance check, but no one knew that that hydraulic system was slowly wearing down after being grinded against the fuel line in a space that was too narrow to accommodate both lines. This was just the calm before the storm. 48-year-old Captain Robert Pichet and First Officer Dirk de Jager, who was 28, both had a very good track record as far as their flying capabilities went. Pichet served a year-long prison sentence in 1985 for smuggling marijuana into the United States from Jamaica. This dance with the dark side lent Pichet an unusual talent for gliding. You see, when he flew the small aircrafts filled to the brim with drugs into the United States, he went down lower than aircraft were allowed to fly, to avoid detection by radar. And he'd cut his engines right before he reached the runway to eliminate noise from the engines and lights from the plane, further camouflaging himself on his illegal rendezvous. This nefarious little talent of his turned out to be an invaluable tool for him in the future. Pichet got caught, did his time, and in 2000 he had completed his parole and was subsequently pardoned of his crimes. Pichet might have dipped his toes over the legal line in his time, but there was nothing questionable about his piloting skills. He'd been flying since he was a teenager and was more comfortable in the cockpit than anyone. De Jager was very capable and showed all the signs of shaping up to be a fantastic pilot with a long career ahead of him. Honestly, those passengers couldn't have asked for a better pairing. Just after midnight on the 24th of August came and everything went according to plan. She was loaded with 47 tons of fuel, which was a little unusual since that's about 4 tons more than is standard. The 293 passengers boarded, as well as the pilots and crew. Altogether, there were 306 people on board, mostly made up of Canadians who were going for a vacation in Portugal, and a mix of expats visiting family back in their home country. They took off at 00:00 52 minutes from Toronto and were scheduled to land in Lisbon, Portugal in the early morning hours shortly after daybreak. And for the first few hours, everything went seemingly well. Unbeknownst to the pilots, the right wing fuel line ruptured at around 4 in the morning. That line that was twisted and forced to fit into a position that it wasn't made for had finally had enough. The constant grinding that the hydraulic and fuel lines were subjected to over their previous 68 hours of flight finally wore the tubing down, and it began to leak fuel. Pichet and de Jager, however, didn't notice that they were receiving more notifications than usual, that there was fuel being transferred from the tail of the plane to make up for the continuous loss of fuel leaking out of the wing. It wasn't until 5:03 before they noticed that there was anything amiss. De Jager was manually checking the system, as was protocol at the time, when he picked up a very unusual reading. On the right wing, the oil temperature was low, but the pressure was high. Both of these readings separately could mean a whole host of possible problems, but seeing them together was almost unheard of. Neither de Jager nor Pichet could recall that they'd come across this in their training, and they remembered correctly. This combination was not a part of standard training. Pichet reported the readings to the control room, but they weren't able to make a call on what the strange readings could mean either, and simply instructed the pilots to monitor the situation. In reality, the craft was losing 13 tons of fuel every hour, and the more fuel it lost, the more the trim tank at the tail sent fuel over to replace the loss. When the tanks were beginning to run low, the system sent them an alert that fuel was low in the right engine at 4:33. Pichet made an off-the-cuff decision to manually send fuel from the left wing to the right. This was a disastrous mistake. That sudden flow of fuel split the rupture even wider. Had Pichet not made this hasty decision, they would have made it to Portugal, even with the heavy leak that they had had before. But the widened crack took that leak from a steady stream to a gush of fuel, bleeding out like a severed artery. In the next 10 minutes, Pichet and de Jager scrambled through their handbooks to find the cause of the sudden drop in fuel in the right wing. They were already looking for viable landing sites that were close to them. They might not have known what was wrong just yet, but they knew they needed to land as quickly as they could. Pichet was beginning to suspect a leak, but if that were true, it was a bigger leak than he'd ever heard of happening before. So he sent a flight attendant over to check on each wing through the windows. Had it been daylight, the flow from the wing would have been glaringly obvious, but in the dead of night, armed with only a flashlight, she didn't see a thing. And since the system had not given any more alerts in the last 10 minutes, Pichet assumed that this was simply a glitch in the system. System glitches were a much more common occurrence and not a problem that was so worrisome that it couldn't wait to be checked out until they landed. And here Pichet made his second deadly mistake. He ran with the theory that it was a fault on the computer and did not do a leak check. And it didn't help that the control tower agreed with him. At 4:45, they'd lost another 7 tons of fuel and they were officially too low to reach Lisbon on what they had left. De Jager called in to let control know that they suspected a computer glitch, but that they were sufficiently alarmed enough to divert to the island of Mayday, 900 miles off the coast of Portugal, just in case. Had Pichet not led extra fuel into the wing and actually done the leak checks like he should have, they would have been able to fly at a low capacity and probably made it to Mayday with a little fuel to spare. Starting with the engineers who signed off on the hasty maintenance and ending with Pichet's decisions made because of habit and complacency, they wouldn't have been in this situation. Pichet, praying that this truly was just a fault in the computer system, headed for Mayday 300 miles away. With only 7 tons of fuel left, he told the crew to let the passengers know that they were doing an emergency landing and to prepare for the worst. Pichet might have misread the situation, and he was still hoping that he was wrong about a leak, but he wasn't an idiot. He'd rather have every person on board prepared for the worst and have it be for nothing than keeping them in the dark and not having prepared them at all. Because if the monitors were indeed telling him the truth, they weren't even going to make it to Mayday. When they heard the news of an emergency landing, the passengers panicked. They cried, they prayed, and they grabbed onto their children and neighbors. But somehow the crew walked them through the procedures of putting on life jackets and oxygen masks, calming them down by arming them with what little they now had at their disposal to survive when they went crashing down into the dark sea. At 5:13, the right engine sputtered and died with a whine that echoed through the plane. 13 minutes later, the left engine went dead, and so did the lights. If the pilots had any reservations and hopes before, those were now completely shattered. They were empty, and they were in more trouble than anyone could have imagined. Everyone was plunged into darkness, and the fragile calm that the flight attendants managed to instill blew up in a collective wail of renewed prayers, screams, and sobs. The darkness was so all-consuming that most of the passengers didn't even see the oxygen masks drop down in front of them, but instead it hit their heads from above. The only power on that plane was supplied by a tiny fan on the undercarriage of the belly that used the wind current to generate enough juice to keep radio communications and the very basic steering control operable. No lights, no landing gear and spoilers, no hydraulics. Half of the brakes and pressurization control were all dead. It was only Pichet on the stick and de Jager on communications. But as the passengers regained their composure, they realized that they weren't plummeting. Oh no, they were gliding. Like a paper plane floating in the wind, Pichet used the laws of aerodynamics to glide them toward the pinprick lights of Laget in the distance. The plane was dropping at 1,500 feet per minute, and if the pilot's calculations were correct, they could make the runway. Actually, they were a little too close. There were no hydraulics and no brakes, so they couldn't control the speed at which they were approaching. If they touched down too late, they'd overshoot the small island and land in the ocean anyway. Hit it too early, and they'd meet the same end. Pichet needed to dig into his drug smuggling days and haul out every ounce of cojones he still had left from the 80s. And boy, did he have more stones left than anyone in the air at that time. With the only sound heard on the now starkly silent plane coming from the wind's howl over the wings, and de Jager's constant stream of updates going over to flight control, they dropped lower and lower, and Laget's lights coming closer and closer. 236 was coming in for the dreaded manual landing. Somewhere along the way, Pichet had managed to keep the plane's altitude high all too well. They were going to overshoot the landing strip by several miles. Whoever thought he could do the job so incredibly well that he'd keep a plane too high with no engines at all? The passengers watched in confusion and horror as their craft turned and the lights of the runway, now backed by the glow of the rising sun, streaked past their windows. The captain needed to lose height, and for that he needed to do a 360-degree turn and rely on some more of the passengers' prayers that would be exactly enough altitude worked off to drop another 5,000 feet. 8 miles away from the runway, he'd already done the calculations, and he knew that they were still technically too high to make the landing, but they were too low to do another 360 turn. It was now or never. If they didn't attempt it, they'd all be dead in the water for sure. He made the loop, and de Jager adjusted the slats on the wings and released the landing gear, knowing full well that without hydraulics and barely any brakes, this was going to be an impact that had the force of a bomb blast. The passengers were told to brace themselves. The flight attendants strapped themselves into seats and did the same. Pichet had his eyes ahead, his ears full of de Jager's readings. Speed, altitude, directions, every angle of the situation was conveyed in rapid succession. Pichet turned the yoke left and right. From the runway it looked like a show of air acrobatics. Inside the plane, the passengers were thrown into each other, held in place only by their safety belts. Pichet wasn't finally giving into the stress. No. This was a very calculated move. He was shaking off as much speed as he could before hitting the tarmac. And then they hit the runway, 3,000 feet farther than they should have. Instantly, 8 of the 12 tires burst with the impact of going at a breakneck speed of 200 knots. The plane bounced into the air once in a shower of sparks before it slammed back to the earth, sending chunks of tarmac flying through the air. The tires seized up, and the left side gear wheels burst into flame from the speed and pressure. Skidding towards death's door, the ocean already in sight beyond the line, 236 finally came to a flaming, smoking halt, just 600 feet away from the end of the runway. And like lightning, the two pilots exited the cockpit and organized a streamlined evacuation that had every passenger and crew member out of the aircraft in just 90 seconds. 2 crew members and 16 passengers had minor injuries to show for their ordeal, but the internal damage was much worse. Most of the survivors suffered from PTSD all of their lives after that day. And with that, the world record was broken for the longest continuous glide by a passenger aircraft without power, and Pichet became the hero who had cheated the Grim Reaper out of 306 souls. But this wasn't the end of Flight 236. The investigation soon revealed the mistakes made during the maintenance operations, Pichet's miscalculations, and air traffic control's failure to make the connections too. This was an internal issue. Pilots were not being trained to recognize every single possible reading, the manuals and the training needed an overhaul, and the constraints put on the technical teams to save money and work fast was putting the safety of passengers in jeopardy. Pichet refuses to sit down for interviews, having only done one shortly after the landing and another at the 20-year anniversary. He maintains that the world is wrong to call him a hero. The responsibility of that day lies solely on him. He was the captain, and his bad calls put them all in danger. It was he who was to blame for the passengers suffering all these years later. But we'd like to agree with the world. If it were any other captain than Pichet, the world would have had 306 less people in it than today. Almost no one had the experience to do that landing, and even fewer people would have kept their cool under the circumstances the way he did. Despite the criticism of his decision-making that exacerbated the problem, the captain was awarded the Superior Airmanship Award for his outstanding navigation and landing of what should have been a doomed attempt and defying gravity for 75 miles straight. He's in his 70s now and has laid down his cap to enjoy a quiet retirement. And de Jager? He hasn't sat down for an interview even once. He's still up there somewhere, and thankfully his tenure in the air has been peaceful and without incident, just the way he likes it. Everyone on board still carries the scars. Recent brain scans of some of the passengers show permanent brain abnormalities that are consistent with survivors of war. Even after all these years, they suffer from PTSD. But their ordeal was not for nothing. Aviation as we know it has changed for the better thanks to Flight 236. Training of pilots and air traffic control, the entire structure of how a workshop floor is managed, and the regulations that an aircraft goes through before it takes flight is nothing like it once was. Not for Canada or the rest of the world. We're all safer in the air thanks to the events of that day. And this is one of the very, very few happy endings in aviation history. Most of the time, an earth-shattering event like this is marred by death, loss, and destruction. But not for the now infamous Azores glider, the record-breaking, aviation-changing vessel in the sky, and the protocols that maintain them forever.